When you hear about unlicensed games, Tengen is usually the first company people think of. Their titles come in these black cartridges and were not authorized by Nintendo. But how good was Tengen at programming games? Were they just as bad as the other unlicensed game companies, or did they actually know what they were doing? Let's take a look. What's going on? It's Podrez coming at you with another video. If you've seen a couple of my videos and you like what I do, hit that subscribe button right there. We just hit 25k, thank you so much for helping me get there. And if you haven't been to my Discord server yet, feel free to check it out, discord.podrez.net, or click on the link in the description. Anyway, let's talk about Tengen. In the mid-80s, Atari Inc. was going through some financial issues due to poor business decisions. The Atari 5200 was expected to be the follow-up to their previous console, but it ended up being a commercial failure. Another failed project was a video game tie-in to the movie E.T. Atari spent a lot of money trying to make this game possible, but the development was rushed in order to make a deadline, and it didn't perform as well as expected. The video game market was beginning to go through a crash, and most of the blame goes to Atari and the CEO, Ray Kassar. Atari Inc. would eventually break up into two different companies. Most of the employees would move over to the newly formed company, Atari Games. Despite the name, the company did not have access to Atari's IPs like Breakout or Asteroids. Instead, they developed their own line of games. Some examples include Paperboy, Gauntlet, Marble Madness, and others. While they were making games in the arcade, the home console market was changing drastically. The NES was released in the US and it made a positive impact. Consumers liked video games again thanks to Nintendo. With the home console market being repaired, Atari Games would begin making games for the NES. However, they were not allowed to participate in the home console market under their current name since the other company, Atari Corporation, had that right, so they decided to release games under the name Tengen. After what happened years earlier with Atari Inc., Nintendo played it safe and introduced some strict policies for their licensees. You had to seek approval from Nintendo before games were published. Nintendo was fully allowed to deny a game if it did not meet their standards. You could also only make 5 games a year, which was extremely limiting if you had a huge library of games. Seeking an official license from Nintendo was also very expensive. You had to pay for all the great cartridge shells, and you were not allowed to make your own. While a lot of companies found these rules to be harsh, most of them were in place to ensure that games met a certain standard of quality. Tengen was not a fan of Nintendo's rules, and they tried to negotiate better terms with them, but they refused. Like most companies in this position, Tengen had no choice but to agree to the harsh rules. As an official licensee, Tengen would publish 3 titles that were approved by Nintendo. But they didn't want to do this long term, so Tengen came up with an idea. Why not make games without Nintendo's authorization? The problem with unlicensed game companies was that they weren't provided with any resources for programming. Fortunately, that doesn't have to be you thanks to today's video sponsor, Skillshare. For those who don't know, it's an online community where you have access to hundreds of classes. If you want to learn how to use a certain program or pick up a new side hustle, Skillshare has you covered. As a programmer and computer science major, I'm impressed at the amount of programming classes Skillshare has. There's a class on Python, which is one of the most versatile languages to learn. They also have a class on Java, which gives you the building blocks to develop programs. For web programming, I recommend the Beginner's Guide to PHP Mastery, which teaches you the basic fundamentals of PHP. These are only a few of the many coding classes that are on Skillshare. Imagine if unlicensed game companies like Color Dreams had access to these. But it doesn't stop at programming. If you have your own YouTube channel, big or small, there's an excellent class on growing your channel. There's also a class on the start to finish process of making a video, like writing the script, filming, and editing. If it's the editing software you're trying to learn, there's a tutorial on Adobe Premiere that teaches you what you need to know. But it doesn't stop there. There's classes on art and illustration, becoming more productive, cooking, marketing and sales, learning how to play an instrument, and much more. If you've ever tried to learn something by yourself, it's not an easy task. But what I like about Skillshare is that you're learning by doing, not just by reading text. If you're interested in programming, video editing, or want to check out the other classes on Skillshare, click on my link below. The first 500 people that do so will receive 1 month free. Thank you, Skillshare, for sponsoring this video. Nintendo had a lockout chip that prevented unlicensed games from working. Some unlicensed game companies bypassed the lockout chip by zapping it with voltage, but Tengen thought this would damage the NES, so they decided to try reverse engineering the lockout chip instead. This way, engineers at Tengen would study the code and figure out how to circumvent it, but employees were unable to figure out how to reverse engineer it. In a desperate attempt to get their games out, Tengen would obtain the code to the 10NES chip from the Copyright Office. Using what they found from the code, they were able to develop their own chip that bypassed Nintendo's lockout system. Right away, Tengen began publishing unlicensed games. This was nice for them because they were able to use their own cartridge shells and therefore not have to pay Nintendo for the gray ones. They could also publish as many games as they wanted, and they didn't have to adhere to Nintendo's rules. Let's talk about Tengen's games. They were in an interesting position compared to other unlicensed game companies because they already had licenses to well-known titles from Sega and Namco. Other companies like Color Dreams had to make their own original games because no company would ever work with them. It's unusual for an unlicensed game company to have access to well-known games like Pac-Man, but Tengen, or Atari Games, was a well-established company. They knew what they were doing before jumping into the NES, but how were their NES games? Let's take a look at some. Tengen had the license to a few of Sega's properties. Let's start off with Shinobi. This game was both developed and published by Tengen. It's a platformer where you walk to the right to beat the stage. You have a projectile that you can throw at enemies. Each stage has a background area and foreground area that you can access by performing a super jump. Unfortunately, this is a very watered down version of the Master System one. The game no longer has any vertical scrolling segments. There's a stage in the Master System version where you have to migrate up in order to beat it. It's a large level, so it takes a while to get there. But because there's no vertical scrolling in the NES version, the level was modified to be horizontal only. Lame. Tengen could have easily pulled off vertical scrolling, so I'm not sure why they didn't. Also, for some reason, you can perform the super jump at any point in the game, even during stages that don't need it. The Master System one did not allow you to do this. You can also access the background areas with your regular jump, which is not supposed to happen. In the Master System game, since they're in the background, you can only access it with the super jump. This is a very sloppy attempt at a Shinobi game. Here's Fantasy Zone. Tengen published this one, but did not develop it. It's a cute 'em up where you must destroy all the enemy bases. When you complete a stage, you fight a boss at the end. There's items in the store that give you new weapons and abilities. Most of the items last temporarily, so you have to be smart when you use them. This is an acceptable version, but a little rough around the edges. The color scheme they picked for some of the stages is weird, and the status bar on the bottom is often hard to read. A lot of the bosses and enemies have very choppy movement. I especially notice this when the first stage boss fires off projectiles. Honestly, at times I feel like I'm playing a bootleg game. Sunsoft would make their own version of Fantasy Zone, and it's way better. The graphics use more appropriate colors, and the bosses have more fluent movement. I'll use the first stage boss as an example again. Notice how much better it looks. The store menu screen is better too. It actually scrolls horizontally so you can see all the items. Tengen's version doesn't scroll at all and instead brings you to a different screen if you want to see the rest. Tengen also had the license to a few of Namco's titles. Pac-Man happened to receive 3 versions on the NES. Tengen released both a licensed and unlicensed version of it. The title screen looks a little different. Obviously, the unlicensed version is missing the Nintendo blurb at the bottom. Years later, Namco published Pac-Man themselves. All 3 versions of the game use the same source code, and the only difference is the title screen. This is a playable version of Pac-Man, but I do think it could have been better. The graphics are a lot different from the arcade version. The ghosts are also slightly discolored, and the sound is off. The game doesn't offer any extra features, it's just the regular game. That's perfectly fine, but later on we'll see what Tengen is really capable of. Here's Rolling Thunder. Tengen published this one but did not develop it. It's a shoot 'em up. You have a limited amount of bullets, but you can grab more by entering doors. You can also find special items in the doors and hide from enemies. You can take 2 hits before dying, but some projectiles kill you in 1. The screen mainly scrolls left and right, but the game does have some fairly large levels that scroll vertically as well. The main problem is the controls. Your character can only shoot directly in front, and is unable to attack enemies above him. He also can't shoot while jumping, which makes it hard to hit enemies on higher platforms. When he touches an enemy, he does jump back, but it's not clear that you've taken damage. I wish the developers made it more obvious that your character has been hit, like a sound or hurt animation. Rolling Thunder is one of my favorite arcade games though, and this is a near perfect port of it. Now for Pac-Mania. This was published but not developed by Tengen. Surprisingly, this version was only released in the US. It's like Pac-Man but in an isometric perspective. You can jump to avoid the ghosts, which is a nice addition, but some of the ghosts can jump as well, which makes them impossible to move past. To make up for the easier gameplay, they added more ghosts that chase you around. The graphics are excellent, and it's cool to see Pac-Man in this sort of 3D perspective. My only issue is the camera. You're not able to see the entire level, so it's difficult to see where the remaining dots are when you think you completed the stage. The music is okay, but not as good as if another company like Konami were involved. Despite the minor setbacks, this is a well-done arcade port. Now let's talk about Ms. Pac-Man. Namco published their own version of it on the NES. This is a playable iteration of the game, but like with the NES version of Pac-Man, they made some odd graphical decisions. None of the levels are colored incorrectly. They went with green on stage 1 rather than pink for some reason. The audio sounds like they didn't even try to mimic the arcade version. There's also no bonus content, it's just Ms. Pac-Man. It's unusual that Namco decided to publish this because years earlier Tengen made their own version of Ms. Pac-Man. This one was both developed and published by Tengen. We see a massive improvement in the graphics. The stages are properly colored and it actually looks like the arcade version. The game even scrolls vertically just to get some extra detail in every possible pixel. Despite the hardware limitations, the audio sounds close to the arcade original. But what really makes this game shine is the bonus content. You can select the difficulty at the beginning and even play at a faster speed. There's the original mode which is unchanged, but there's also modes that have new levels. This is a really nice bonus that adds a lot of replayability to the game. This is essentially a director's cut version of Ms. Pac-Man. Tengen really went above and beyond by giving us more than expected. This is one of Tengen's best titles and arguably one of the best unlicensed games ever made. One last game I wanted to talk about is Hard Drivin. This was a planned NES game that was never finished. It's a driving game, obviously, where you go through obstacles. The game is very ambitious for attempting a legitimate 3D perspective. You might be able to tell why it was not released though. It doesn't look very appealing and the frame rate is terrible. The NES was not meant to have a game like this, so it really does show what Tengen is capable of. There's no other NES game out there like this one. I just wanted to give you an idea of what some of their games were like. We definitely see a much higher standard of quality with these titles than with most other unlicensed game companies. Some games like Shinobi were not great, but Tengen really showed what they were capable of with titles like Ms. Pac-Man. These weren't just rookie developers that didn't know how to program for the NES. This was a team of experienced members. Unfortunately, things would not go well for Tengen. Remember before when they obtained the patent information for the 10NES chip and used it for their own chip? Nintendo didn't like that and would sue Tengen over it. Now, making unlicensed games is not illegal. Many other companies were getting away with it. It's the manner of how Tengen was bypassing the lockout chip that was the problem. Nintendo would ultimately win the suit and Tengen would be forced to recall all their games. Unfortunately for Tengen, it just did not work out. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.